Speaker Madigan, this is affecting Article 9, which is the revenue article of the Constitution. And to follow up on one of the previous speakers who talked about a dollar amount, as I read it, there is currently no specific dollar amounts that occur anywhere in Article 9 of the Constitution. Is that correct?
The answer is yes.
And there are certainly other types of provisions, percentages, ratios that provide there. I know you were an active participant when our current Constitution was drafted. Is there any reason that you can think of that would be why we might not have put any dollar amounts into the revenue article of our Constitution?
You're very kind to characterize my activity as active. Very kind of you. And I don't know the answer to your question.
Well, let me suggest, could it be that because we're subject to inflation, the value of the dollar changes over time, that the drafters might not want to have put a specific dollar value, knowing that the Constitution is a difficult instrument to change, as you just pointed out in your earlier answers?
That may have been a collective motivation of the delegates to the convention. I think it's significant that that particular convention voted against the graduated income tax. That's the convention that provided for a flat rate tax. And this would simply give the voters an opportunity to move somewhat away from that decision of 1970.
Is there anything in your proposed constitutional amendment that would index that $1 million amount to inflation?
The answer is no.
To the amendment, the federal government actually provides a tool online where one can check to see what the dollar value of any given amount would be either in the past or in the future. And so I looked to see if I looked at $1 million today in the year 2015, what would that have been equivalent to in dollars back in 1970, at the time the Constitution was drafted and approved? And the answer is $164,000. So had the drafters wanted to have the effect of today in 2015 of writing in $1 million, the number that one would have written into the document back in 1970 would have been $164,000. Now, as I understand it from the Department of Revenue, that roughly 0.5% of the households in Illinois would be subject to this amendment as proposed. But if I were looking at a number like $164,000, that number starts approaching something like 10% of the households in Illinois. It becomes a much more significant number. The problem is that inflation will change that value of the dollar. And without any kind of protection against inflation, what we'll see is something that we may well intend to affect just that very small percentage earning over $1 million. If it were another 45 years before this body put forward an amendment affecting that particular section of the revenue article of the Illinois Constitution, one might well see that people who today were making $164,000, if we had the same kind of inflation over the next 45 years as over the last 45 years, they would be subject to this surcharge that's proposed in the amendment. And I think that's very important because the year before our Constitution was written in 1969, the United States government passed a thing called the Alternative Minimum Tax, the AMT for short. And it was designed to make sure that certain very high wage earners did not get away from paying their fair share of federal income tax. And what they did is they wrote that number in, and they did not put in anything to adjust it for inflation. And over the ensuing next decades, the buying power of the numbers in the brackets that were set forth in AMT, of course, shifted because we had inflation to the point where by certainly the early 1990s, roughly 20 years ago, there was an ongoing effort to put patches to somehow deal with the fact the AMT was now casting a net much broader than the drafters of that act may have intended. And that went on and on and on with patch after patch, long debates in Congress. And finally, in 2012, signed into law in the beginning of 2013, they finally fixed it and indexed it to the CPI, essentially to the Consumer Price Index, which accounts for inflation, so that it would only affect those people who it was intended to affect at the time it became effective. But this amendment lacks that protection. Furthermore, unlike the congressional problem of the AMT, that was just a statute in the U.S. Code. An act of Congress signed by the President could change it. This would require the much longer and more difficult process of putting forward a constitutional amendment approved by supermajorities of both the House and Senate, and then approved by the voters either by 50% of those who vote, 50% of all voters, or 60% of those who cast ballots on the question. A much more difficult standard. So if the AMT was a problem, which we know it was, all we have to do is look at the lengthy debates, we would be faced with exactly the same sorts of problems here in Illinois, trying to figure out how to get around, how to patch this act, because it doesn't even have the kind of protections that we recognize because inflation exists. And it changes over time. It may be really low now, and there may be other times when it approaches double digits or more. That's happened certainly in my lifetime. I have no reason to expect it won't happen the next few decades again. So for those reasons, I think that this would have an impact far beyond what we might see when we see the number $1 million. Wow, that's a big number. I'm never going to earn that. But in fact, your children, your grandchildren, are very likely to earn that number and be subject to that tax because of the effects of inflation.